Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into an area that's really at the forefront of global finance, and that's beneficial ownership regulations, but specifically focusing on North America.
Absolutely, and we'll be breaking down the insights from a great resource we have. It's the UBO 2025 Magazine Digital by Regions report by Adrian Camara.
This report is from 2025, so we get a really good look into, how things have evolved.
Exactly.
Our goal today is to give you a clear picture of the similarities and the differences in how the U.S., Canada, and Mexico are approaching this really critical topic.
And I think it's important to just baseline everyone on what we mean by beneficial ownership, right? The FATF defines it as identifying and verifying the real people who ultimately own or control a company. And this is, really essential to preventing financial crimes like money laundering and terrorist financing.
Definitely a complex topic with huge implications.
Absolutely.
So let's unpack it, starting with the United States. The Corporate Transparency Act, the CTA.
Yes.
That seems to be a game changer in this area.
Absolutely. It's a very significant development. The CTA essentially mandates that most corporations and LLCs in the U.S. have to report their beneficial ownership information directly to FinCEN. And, this is a really big step in increasing transparency around who's really behind these companies.
So who exactly needs to be reported under the CTA?
Well, the guidelines state individuals with 25% or more ownership or those who exert substantial influence.
Substantial influence. What does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So while the 25% ownership is a pretty straightforward measure, substantial influence basically aims to capture those individuals who might not hit that ownership threshold, but still hold significant sway over the company's decisions.
Got it.
So, this could be someone with, key executive positions. Maybe they have a significant amount of decision-making power, or perhaps they have the authority to appoint or remove the majority of the board of directors,
Oh, I see.
The idea is to look beyond just the ownership on paper and consider the actual control.
Right, so it's really getting to the heart of who's pulling the strings.
Exactly.
Now, this information is all reported to a system called BOSS, the Beneficial Ownership Secure Search System.
Yes.
Quite a name, but there's a lot of discussion around the system not being publicly accessible.
Right. This is a really interesting point and one that generates a lot of debate.
Okay.
So while BOSS has restricted access, mainly to regulators, law enforcement, and financial institutions under certain conditions, this non-public nature is actually seen by some as a bit of a departure from what a lot of international organizations are advocating for.
They want more transparency.
Exactly. They believe that for these registers to be truly effective in deterring illicit activities, they need to be open to public scrutiny.
Makes sense.
So there's a bit of a tension there.
Okay, what about trusts? They're often used, in more complex ownership structures. How are they handled under the CTA?
So if a trust owns or controls a reporting company in the U.S., the CTA generally requires reporting of the beneficial owners of that trust. It's meant to prevent trusts from being used to kind of shield the identities of the actual people in control.
So another layer of transparency there.
Right.
The guide also talks about people with significant control or a PSC register. Is that something fully operational at a national level in the U.S. yet?
Well, according to our 2025 source, while the CTA does mandate this central system for reporting beneficial ownership information, a fully implemented PSC register, like what some other countries have established, isn't quite there yet in the U.S.
Interesting. So still a work in progress.
It seems so.
And what about companies or entities owned from overseas? Are there specific requirements for them to register in the U.S.?
So there isn't a comprehensive register of overseas entities like you might find in some other countries.
Okay.
However, the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, or FIRMA,
FIRMA,
does include certain disclosure obligations for foreign-owned entities, specifically related to national security concerns.
I see. So targeted disclosure requirements.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, so the U.S. has made some major strides with the CTA, but it sounds like there are some areas that are still evolving.
Yeah, definitely.
What were some of the key challenges that were highlighted in the report, specifically regarding the U.S. system?
Well, one of the major challenges that was discussed was this delicate balance between the need for transparency to combat financial crime and the concerns around data privacy. And, that's led to this non-public database, and that's something that's still being debated and discussed quite a bit.
Yeah, makes sense.
Another challenge is ensuring compliance across the board, especially when you consider the sheer number of small businesses operating in the U.S.
Right. That's a huge task.
It is. It's a logistical challenge for FinCEN to really make sure everyone is on board.
Yeah, I can imagine. And, of course, the U.S. has that decentralized state system.
Exactly. And that adds another layer of complexity, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because you can have variations and inconsistencies in how this beneficial ownership information is managed across different states.
So it's definitely a system that's still, being fine-tuned, and I guess we'll see how it continues to evolve.
Right.
Okay, so let's move north now and look at how Canada is tackling this issue of beneficial ownership transparency.
So Canada's approach to beneficial ownership is primarily governed by the Anti-Money Laundering and Anti-Terrorist Financing Act, or AMLAT-TF.
Okay, AMLAT-TF, and how does it define beneficial ownership?
Well, a key element is this requirement for companies to keep their own internal register of individuals with significant control.
Okay, so similar to the U.S. in that regard.
Yeah, very similar. And the definition of significant control is also aligned with the U.S. standard focusing on individuals who own 25% or more of the company's shares or voting rights.
Okay, so that 25% threshold seems to be a common benchmark internationally.
Yes, it's a widely recognized standard.
Now, is this register that companies have to maintain in Canada, is that publicly available?
So while Corporations Canada launched its Individuals with Significant Control Register in 2024, it's not consistently publicly accessible at the federal level.
Interesting. But the report highlights something really unique about Canada, doesn't it?
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. The different provinces have a lot of autonomy.
Oh,
For example, British Columbia and Ontario have established their own publicly accessible PSC registers.
so a bit of a mixed bag depending on where you are.
Exactly. It creates the situation where the rules around disclosure and who can see this information differ depending on whether a company is federally incorporated or incorporated in one of these
So
provinces.
it's a patchwork.
Yeah, you could call it that, and it can be really challenging for businesses that operate across different provinces.
Yeah, trying to navigate all these different regulations.
Exactly. It can be a real compliance headache.
What about trusts in Canada? Are they required to disclose beneficial ownership as well?
Yes. Under Canada's AML legislation, trusts also have reporting obligations for beneficial ownership.
Okay, so trusts are definitely within the scope.
Yes, they are.
Now, does Canada have a specific register for entities that are owned or controlled from outside the country?
As of 2025, our source indicates that Canada had not yet implemented a dedicated register of overseas entities.
Got it. So what are some of the key challenges that Canada faces in this area based on what we saw in the report?
Well, I think one of the most prominent challenges is this lack of consistency in disclosure requirements across different provinces.
Yeah, that definitely came up.
And it's a significant issue for businesses and for regulators. Another challenge is the level of enforcement of the existing regulations. There's ongoing discussion about whether it's robust enough, and similar to the U.S., the debate around public accessibility of this data continues.
So finding that balance between transparency and privacy.
Exactly. It's a tricky one.
Okay, let's shift gears now and head south to Mexico.
Sounds good.
How's Mexico approaching beneficial ownership regulations?
So our guide characterized Mexico's framework as being in a developmental phase as of 2025, although it's being guided by those international standards and, of course, that increase in global pressure to strengthen measures against money laundering.
Okay, so still a work in progress, but moving in that direction of greater transparency.
Definitely.
What are the current requirements in Mexico for disclosing beneficial owners?
So currently, companies and trusts in Mexico are required to disclose their beneficial ownership information to the country's tax authority.
Okay, that would be the SAT.
Exactly, the Servicio de Administración Tributaria.
And is there a specific registry where this information is held?
Yes. Mexico actually launched its beneficial ownership reporting system back in 2022.
Okay.
But similar to the U.S. system, access to that system is limited to the registrar relevant authorities and certain regulated entities.
So again, not publicly available.
No, not at this point.
The report points out a really significant difference between Mexico and the U.S. and Canada, though, doesn't it?
Yes, this is a key distinction.
Ah.
As of 2025, Mexico did not have a centralized or publicly accessible registry that's specifically dedicated to PSC information or general beneficial ownership information beyond what's reported to the tax authorities.
Okay, so no dedicated PSC register. And what about foreign-owned entities?
Right. And there were no specific requirements for entities that are owned overseas either.
So no register for overseas entities in Mexico either.
Not as of the time of this report, no.
And just to reiterate, so trusts are required to disclose their beneficial owners, but primarily to the tax authorities.
That's correct.
So taking all this into account, what are some of the key challenges that Mexico faces when it comes to beneficial ownership transparency?
I think one of the major challenges highlighted in the guide is this lack of a centralized beneficial ownership register.
Okay.
And that really hinders effective enforcement. It makes it difficult to verify compliance thoroughly.
Right. It limits the ability to connect the dots.
Exactly. And the fact that it's not publicly accessible, that also limits transparency, which can be a concern, for various stakeholders, including foreign investors who might want to have a clear understanding of the ownership structures they're dealing with.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a barrier.
And all of this, kind of points to a less formalized approach in Mexico compared to the U.S. and Canada, especially the absence of those publicly available registers.
So it's really interesting to see these three very different approaches all within one continent.
Definitely.
So looking at the bigger picture, what kind of cross-border implications do these differences create?
Well, it creates quite a complex environment for multinational companies that are operating across North America, right?
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
You have 3 different systems: a centralized but non-public system in the U.S., a federal system with all these provincial variations in Canada, and then a developing system in Mexico that doesn't have that central public registry.
So keeping track of all of that must be a real headache.
Absolutely. It's a significant compliance challenge.
Yeah, trying to navigate these different definitions and reporting requirements and levels of access to information.
Exactly. And even just the thresholds for identifying beneficial owners, right? That can vary between the countries.
Right.
And then you have the varying degrees of public accessibility to these registries and whether or not there's a specific register for overseas entities. So it's a lot to keep track of.
It's almost like a compliance minefield.
It can definitely feel that way.
Now, the guide being connected to Athennian naturally, highlights how their platform helps organizations manage these complexities.
Right. Athennian being a company focused on providing compliance solutions, so they emphasize their role in streamlining the UBO and KYC process.
Right. KYC, know your customer.
Exactly. And that's definitely a crucial need given this landscape we've been discussing.
Absolutely. Now, this whole conversation fits into a much larger global trend, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This push for greater transparency and beneficial ownership is a global phenomenon.
And the guide mentioned some of the key players driving this trend.
Yes. Organizations like the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, and the G20 have really been instrumental in advocating for and setting those global standards for beneficial ownership transparency.
And by 2025, the report points out that a significant number of G20 countries and top global economies had implemented some form of UBO regulations.
Yes, so it's definitely a movement that's gaining momentum worldwide.
So to wrap things up, what are the key takeaways regarding beneficial ownership regulations in North America as of 2025?
Well, I think the main takeaway is just how different the stages of development are and the distinct paths each country has chosen. The U.S. has a relatively new centralized system, but it's not publicly accessible. Canada has that federal framework, but with these significant variations at the provincial level and limited federal public access. And then Mexico's system is still in those early stages of development and doesn't have a central public registry for broader UBO information.
Right. And each country also has its own specific challenges to overcome.
Yes, absolutely. Whether it's achieving genuine transparency, ensuring widespread compliance, or dealing with the complexities of overseas ownership, each country has its own unique set of hurdles to clear.
It's a great illustration of how, even within a closely integrated economic region like North America, regulatory approaches can vary so much.
Absolutely.
And I think that leads to a really interesting question for our listeners to consider.
Okay.
Given these very different approaches to beneficial ownership transparency within North America, what are the potential long-term implications for international trade? And how will these different approaches impact those global efforts to combat financial crime?
Yeah.
And with the global trend leaning towards live and potentially more public UBO registers, how might that influence North America in the coming years?
Definitely something to keep an eye on.
It's a dynamic landscape and one that's going to continue to shape the financial world.
Absolutely.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into beneficial ownership regulations in North America.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
See you then.
Bye.